titled my research Finding the Phoenix Factor, and hopefully that will become clear to you in a moment if I can just get my technology working. I want to explain first of all my research hypothesis, the successful adaptation of disused industrial heritage and how that can drive in economic and social regeneration in remote Icelandic communities. So I'll try and explain a little bit about the regional economic issues to begin with. These are essentially those that are facing coastal communities who have experienced economic adversity in the last few decades through the decline of the fishing industry and the imposition, or rather the loss of quota. This combined with technological change such as factory trawlers has meant less demand for onshore processing. This in turn has led to depopulation. The first of these categories on this list really describes the extractive industries, and those are the industries that form the research, specifically that of fisheries. For reasons of logistics and consistency, and also because of Iceland's monothematic history of industrialization, I chose not to research other categories, which you can see on this list. Much of the industrial infrastructure associated with fisheries remains in place in remote communities: fish factories, processing plants, freezer units, oil tanks, and jetties. And it's these structures that form the basis of my research. So to begin my analysis, I established five broad research topics, and I'll just go through those now. I wanted to understand the conservation methods that industrial heritage sites use. I wanted to understand the safeguarding and protection afforded to those structures through legislation. I wanted to see what the operational priorities are that the site managers experience and identify. And I wanted to understand how we define their success and also the factors behind that success. So those were the five overall topics that I identified. And from those, I then designed 6 specific research questions. Those are as follows. What is the relationship between the industrial heritage sites and their communities? How do we define value and success at these sites? How do we see the support afforded by stakeholders on both regional and national levels? And what are the commonalities experienced between the sites? What are the challenges and obstacles that success affords to these projects? And how are these buildings protected? So those are the 6 research questions. And from that, I identified a series of sites that I wanted to analyze, which I'll show on this map. So the 16 research sites, if you're familiar with Iceland, you will know that obviously the University Centre is based in the West Fjords. That to some extent determined the selection of sites from a practical point of view. They were also selected by virtue of research and also because obviously of the availability of my interviewees, which I'll talk about in a moment. But essentially, it meant to some extent that there were limitations of covering the south and the southeast. These are available on an interactive map, and if you'd like to see the slides, I'd be happy to send those to you. But I'm going to just give you the list of those sites briefly, and then I'm going to run through each of them through categories. If you're familiar with any of these sites, hopefully they will stand out to you as interesting examples of industrial heritage. So what I did was I categorized 5 types of use or interpretation. Those are as follows. The first I've described as educational or didactic interpretation. And these are essentially sites that use a classic interpretation of the former purpose of the building to explain their function. And of these, I've included the herring factory at Siglufjörður, which is now, of course, the Herring Era Museum, the historic warehouse at Ísafjörður, which, if you're familiar with the West Fjords, you'll know as the West Fjords Heritage Museum. And within the second of my types or interpretation categories, I've called those buildings that perform different functions from their original content. And in those, I've included buildings such as the Kia Dairy in Akureyri, which you'll recognize as the Art Museum, the Dairy Factory just on the outskirts of Reykjavik, which is now the Koppelstadia Art Gallery and Residency, the former slaughterhouse in Húsavík, which you'll probably recognize as the Whale Museum, and the previous fish freezer in Reef, which is now a successful theatre venue and hostel. So that was my second interpretation type. My third I've called commercial spaces and hybrid hubs. This, for instance, is a photograph of the successful restaurant in the Marshall House in the Grandi area of Reykjavik, which was a former herring factory, and you'll maybe recognize as the home now of several successful art galleries and restaurants. The enormous site that is the former fertilizer factory on the outskirts of Reykjavik at Gubernes, and this will now become movie studios and creative spaces. And again, if you're in Ísafjörður, you'll recognize the former co-op as the Edinburgh House, which is also a culture center and bar restaurant. And finally, in this category of commercial and hybrid uses, the Salting House in Skagastad is a popular guest house. So that was my third interpretation type. And then there are the buildings that conserve rather than restore, is how I've described them. They've essentially chosen to maintain a certain level of abandonment. And if you're familiar with Djúpavik, you'll recognize the former herring factory, which is now a museum and film location. And also the huge and daunting building of Hjaltari, the former herring factory, which is now the Center for Contemporary Art. And the final of these 5 categories, those are the buildings at risk of loss or demolition. And I've included in that the former tool sheds in Akureyri, which you'll see as the industry museum, but maybe facing closure in the near future. The former fish factory in Skagastad, which is now the artist residency Nes, but has workshops alongside that are due to be demolished. And the former herring factory at Rauberhofen, which is also abandoned and may be demolished. And finally, the transformer station at Botnafjörður, which is Thordarson's work and is now planned for demolition this summer. So those are my 16 sites. 13 of them were in rural locations, 3 in the capital area, as you've noticed. And I just want to explain a little bit now about my interviews. These were undertaken in 2 stages between November and March in the year before, and September and January this year. And the first of those stages were unstructured interviews. The second were semi-structured. The first of those stages were completed just before the lockdown restrictions as COVID became apparent, and they were conducted face-to-face. The second I considered conducting online, but I chose, as restrictions were lifted at the end of the period of spring, to do them face-to-face, and there weren't any objections raised to that. So in the end, 30 out of the 35 stage 2 interviews were conducted in person. A key condition was that the participants agreed to be identified in the research and that their comments would be attributable. The interviews were carried out in English, and each was recorded using an AI app called Temi, and they lasted on average about 90 minutes. So I'm just going to talk to you briefly about my methodology before moving on to the results. I created full verbatim transcripts of all my interviews, and then used an analysis app called MaxQDA to help me devise a 2-level coding system. 2,830 segments were coded into a primary level system, and they were based on those 5 initial research topics which I introduced at the beginning. And then these were then sub-categorized into 32 further codes. And data from the primary coding operation was then selected and recoded into a secondary level to address the 6 research questions that I described. And that then created 42 secondary subcodes. As part of the interview analysis, I also created single case model visualizations, using max maps as part of the max QDA package. And that enabled me to cross-reference and analyze responses as a function of each interview. And this slide just shows a sample of one of those interviews. The last part of the methodology involved creating heat maps from code matrices, and these were done for both the primary and secondary levels. And that helped me to determine the frequency of responses within each subcode. So that's the brief outline of the methodology. I won't go into it in any further detail. It's all available in the thesis if you'd like to read it. But I want to talk about the results, which I think are hopefully a little bit more interesting, and I hope you'll find so too. Just to clarify that these 6 research questions, I will run some of the comments that really stood out to me, but I won't read through the comments. And equally, I've only just picked out the subcategories or the subcodes that have really jumped out at me, because I can't, obviously, in terms of space of time, go through the 42 subcodes that were generated. So the first research question, you may remember, related to how industrial sites engage with their local communities. And this question really considers subjects like collective memory, civic pride, identity, community engagement, and volunteer opportunities. And the first code that really jumped out at me, I've called shame and humiliation. Many local residents and participants expressed negative associations relating to industrial structures. They seem to associate them with hardship and poverty. And this seemed to lead to a general resistance to place value on industrial architecture. The sites were linked with economic failure, even abandonment by former employers, and perceptions of having been exploited or used by foreign interests, including the Danish occupation, and treatment of Icelanders in the past by foreigners as uncultured. Responses often described shame and stigma attached to living in turf houses and barrack buildings, and also cited a certain unworthiness linked to 20th century architecture in Iceland, with comments like our buildings aren't good enough. Shame was also linked to decisions by municipalities to sell off fishing quota and the impact on local industry. So that was one of the subcodes in this question that really jumped out at me. Another I've described as volunteerism, and that really created a very mixed and confused response among my participants. Many opinions were expressed that labour unions were opposed to volunteering because it was seen as undermining paid work. This is something I've found a little bit difficult to understand, but it was cited as just not part of the national culture, particularly for young people, that it evoked notions of exploitation, for instance, which I also found confusing because volunteering is clearly active in search and rescue in Iceland and within the Red Cross, for instance. And from my experience of running volunteer-led heritage projects in the UK for many years, I was very aware of how important volunteering is in the conservation of sites such as these, an experience that is common across Europe and the US. But managers just seemed unclear about the legality of hiring volunteers and also how to advertise volunteer programs. So that was my first research question. The second, you may recall, I wanted to try and understand how we place value or define success on these buildings. And the first of the subcodes that struck me, I've called regenerative hubs. And to explain what I mean by that, most of the successful projects that I researched often were those that had become hubs within their communities. They provide art spaces, learning programs, innovation centers, and they seem able to create what I've described as a critical mass of local participation, which then in turn leads to a cycle of renewal and positive feedback, and seems to then be capable of reversing out migration. What was particularly interesting to me was a growing trend of incomers and domestic tourists who seemed keen to move to rural areas or to visit rural areas as urban populations have been reassessing their lifestyle priorities and health security, obviously post-COVID. And those rural communities that seem to offer, let's call it an open outlook, and are capable of embracing these new ideas from incomers, seemed best placed to create these regenerative hubs. And one of the examples that was often cited was the Herring Era Museum, which has, if you're familiar with the town, led to substantial investment in other projects such as the Siglo Hotel, and has become in itself a popular destination. So the second of my subcodes within this research question, I've identified as partnerships and trails. Basically this really, as you can imagine, is about collaboration. It's about sites that have found the benefits of joint initiatives with other similar sites and who have grouped together their marketing and signposting and tourist trails. And all of those were seen as important in building public awareness. But despite all of this, the data seem to highlight a real disconnect with European trails. One that stood out in particular was the European route of industrial heritage, which seems almost unknown in Iceland, and maybe explains this limited public awareness of industrial heritage. It also seems strange that there was no connection with advocacy groups for the 20th century built environments, such as Docomomo International, which promotes the value of the modern movement. So that was my second research question. And I'll move on to the third, which you may remember as being that of support from key stakeholders. I really wanted to look at whether national and local policy supports industrial heritage, and obviously the level of funding. And the first subcode, which again seems to be somewhat negative, but is realistic to the data, identified frequent dissatisfaction among respondents in terms of national and local strategic planning. I was really surprised to learn that policies were drawn up between government departments without consultation between themselves, and that local municipalities apparently make unilateral decisions about demolition that are often contrary to the recommendations of the National Culture Agency, Minjastofnun. The second subcode within this category I've identified as related to the previous, and that is specific to tourism policy. I wanted to see how tourism policy supports heritage conservation. And again, I was very surprised to hear from the participants that there is almost no crossover between tourism policy and the built environment. And participants told me that regional development plans are apparently not required to consider the contribution of building heritage to the overall tourism offer. I found that alarming given the importance that the built environment plays in tourism strategies in European countries, and in particular in France, where I live, how important it seems to be to the tourism offer here. The next of my research questions analyzed the commonalities experienced between sites. And the first of the subcodes that I identified, I've called the gold rush mentality, because there seemed to be a perception by site managers of something of a battle against what they described as a cultural tendency to prioritize commercial entrepreneurship, resulting in planning authorities approving demolition over other options, as I've mentioned. And this, what I've described as rush to demolish, seems to follow this economic imperative without much consideration of historic significance or even of environmental impact. For instance, total life cycle cost or loss of embodied carbon that results from demolition. And this is related to much corporate and political messaging that I've uncovered that claims commitment to environmental responsibility, but seems to identify little or no incentive for local planning decisions to consider waste minimization. So on a sociological note, and I don't know how accurate this is, I'd be very interested to hear comments. Many of the participants aligned this gold rush tendency with the mindset of the fishing industry and characterized the mentality of seeking immediate opportunity without lengthy deliberation. Again, as I say, I'm not clear whether that's accurate, but it seemed interesting to me. Another of the commonalities that I identified as experience between sites, I've called the visionary. This relates to the commonly experienced phenomenon of a driven visionary founder who sees the potential of an industrial space and has the talent to imagine the completed project. These individuals are good communicators. They use their skills to launch conservation campaigns. They galvanize support against demolition. This visionary founder model, if you like, is often an in-migrant, bringing fresh ideas from outside and capable of organizing social capital for the benefit of the project. The research highlighted the contribution of individuals, particularly artists, as skilled in visualizing unrealized ideas, which I'm sure you can imagine is an important asset. And these individuals become the founders, often unpaid, of these conservation efforts. They demonstrate highly determined personalities and are a critical force in a project's startup. The next of my subcodes within the commonalities question, I've just simply called ugly and dirty. And I'm sure you can understand why. Industrial structures are simply very often called unsightly. And this therefore leads to much of the rationale behind demolition. They are considered unworthy of serious recognition. And because of this, they are also to some extent linked back to these stories of shame and failure. They're considered a blight on the landscape and so forth. And related to this, some of the comments from participants seem to identify the fact that the buildings are associated within a working class narrative, that their functional appearance is associated with a lack of elegance, let's say, or a lack of sophistication. Those faculties more normally associated with the built environment of the bourgeoisie or the aristocracy, such as castles, cathedrals, and stately homes. And these perceptions, as you can imagine, are quickly reversed once a conservation program is completed and a project is made available to the public. And I'm sure if you've ever visited the Marshall House, the Equerry Art Museum, the Herring Era Museum, you will certainly not attribute them with notions of ugliness or dirtiness, but I'm sure that when they were in a state of ruin, they had to encounter that kind of opinion. So my fifth research question wanted to explore the challenges and the obstacles faced by these sites. And the first of these subcodes that I identified, I've simply called scale. Industrial architecture represents a daunting challenge in terms of conservation. It creates practical difficulties of access for both contractors and audiences, and the physical scale of these sites is a significant challenge, but also, I hope you would agree with me, part of their appeal. It's a significant part of the plus and the minus, if you like. Not just in terms of the conservation challenge of getting labor and materials to the site, but also running costs, and of course in Iceland, heating costs. And yet the combination of scale in these extraordinary natural locations in remote communities is integral to their appeal and their uniqueness. And as a function of scale, sorry to sound so negative, but the issue that really stood out to me was one of burnout, which is very much linked to that challenge of scale. Respondents often mention their personal struggle to maintain motivation and drive. These large impractical structures create endless operational challenges, and despite their impressive dedication, these individuals, these visionary founders that I've described, are often at considerable loss to make their projects work. They regularly face insurmountable odds, including the short-termism of funding strategies, and they experience sporadic public support, even opposition in some cases. And the next subcode within the challenges that are faced, I've called skepticism, and that harks back to the previous point. Many respondents described struggling with negative public perceptions when it comes to the idea of repurposing factories. However, and I thought this was particularly interesting, maritime heritage in Iceland appears to be, in the perception of my participants, somewhat glorious, even heroic, and ultimately worth saving. And one of the questions that were raised was whether this perhaps reflects a largely masculine historic narrative, but that's something that would need to be explored by other research. Other negative risk perceptions that were attributed seem to rest on a metropolitan-rural divide. A lot of urban opinion seems resentful of infrastructure spending in remote communities. And if you're Icelandic, maybe you'll recognize one particular recent source of skepticism that was associated with the conservation of a barrack building, which went vastly over budget, became the focus of media derision, and certainly did nothing for the public support of industrial heritage conservation. So that was my fifth research question. I'll come on to my last, which is that of legal protection for buildings. And specifically the subcode that jumped out at me was the age listing rule, which is enshrined in the Cultural Heritage Act 2013. And this automatically protects all buildings in Iceland over 100 years old and is administered by Minjastofnun. Some of the respondents questioned its efficacy, suggesting that it operates as a blunt instrument. There were suggestions that it's no longer fit for purpose. And interestingly, I found that it commits the state to subsidies for conservation across an increasing stock of buildings, which seems logical, but not all of which are of historical or architectural value. And with regards to 20th century buildings, the regulator is seen as prioritizing something of an advisory role or a light touch. And that is the role that seems easily ignored by the municipalities that I've mentioned, with a lot of these demolition decisions made without reference to national context. So respondents also questioned whether the statutory mechanism to stop demolition is efficient and effective. These are the temporary stop orders that seem to be somewhat cumbersome. They're only valid for a few weeks. They require the culture minister's authorization, and they're therefore rarely used. And one example that really struck me that was highlighted by some of the participants was that of a building that was saved when it was only, in inverted commas, 70 years old, as far back as 1977. And this is the example of Rolfsbraki at the Herringera Museum, which was protected when a ruin, and certainly probably untidy, and is now the centerpiece of the successful Herring Museum and the regeneration of Siglufjörður. So a great example of how a building, a 20th century building saved only 70 years after it was built, is now seen as having tremendous value. And the last of my codes just relates to those buildings that are at risk of loss and demolition. And these I've just touched on in the slides, but I'll just reiterate. They are the former herring factory at Raupahofen, the workshops at Skagastrand next to Ness, possibly the transformer house at Popnafjörður, or more likely this summer that is scheduled for demolition, despite a specific report by Minjastofnun that cites its architectural significance. And that is a clear example of how easily the culture agency seems to be sidelined when its carefully considered view doesn't seem to suit local opinion or the local authority. So hopefully that's given you a reasonable view of my research. And from that, I've drawn up 5 brief conclusions, which I hope you'll find logical from the data that was evident in the interviews. The first is that statutory legislation as it stands that relies on this 100-year age listing simply leaves 20th century significant buildings unprotected. Second of my conclusions is that there is a lack of public awareness of the importance of 20th century and also significant industrial heritage, and that this may be linked to these points of hardship or collective memory of recent more difficult times, and that this may lead to a general drive to demolish. The third is that there is clearly a lack of coherent planning between departments, and that there is a lack of protection and strategy for 20th century buildings. And the fourth, that regional funding appears piecemeal. Many of the sites that I've mentioned are being lost. or have been already lost. And the fifth is that the benefits of volunteering are being missed out on as a result of what I can only describe as some kind of cultural suspicion, but I'd be very interested to hear any comments on that as well. So those were my 5 conclusions, and I just want to circle back to my research hypothesis and try and understand whether or not I can prove it, and I will try to explain some of my thoughts. Many significant industrial buildings clearly have already been demolished or are close to being lost. But as you've seen in the slides, many stand as great monuments that have been successfully transformed. They've been adapted into museums, commercial businesses, cultural venues, galleries, co-working spaces, tech hubs, studios, artist residencies, the list goes on. But many of these projects show that creatively repurposed industrial sites do have the capacity to revitalize economically stagnant areas, and that they can contribute agency and engagement and empowerment to local communities. Other sites that I've identified are obviously at a more fragile juncture and will need greater support to achieve this level of critical mass that's required for regenerative effects to take place. And others, of course, it may already be too late. Just to conclude, I wanted to point out, obviously the research took place in between the COVID pandemic, and it really seemed to highlight to me that in a post-COVID era, Icelandic tourism will obviously have to find new ways to reinvent itself. And this seemed to tie in with many of the comments of the participants who spoke of a need to move away from the unsustainable low-cost tourism of the past decade. And the research shows that intelligently executed conservation projects can clearly do just that. They seem to be able to provide a key element in the process of change towards what is described as a more qualitative or engaged or slower tourism. And successful projects that are supported with networks like ERI and Docomomo have the potential to speak particularly to domestic tourists, which I thought was quite an interesting point raised by many managers who experienced high traffic of domestic tourists over the summer last year. Excuse me. And finally, the research just highlights the need to directly support the catalyzing forces behind all of these initiatives, these driven individuals who have a singular vision, who advocate for conservation, and who battle against what is often mainstream local opposition, often for themselves at substantial financial and personal cost, and ultimately end up as unpaid guardians of a national resource. This energy that needs to be supported and channeled can create these powerful and lasting cultural icons, and they can obviously, if supported, show how they can become significant investment multipliers in these communities. So I guess you could say that my hypothesis is to a large extent proven, but with several critical caveats that would need to be addressed in order to deliver the benefits of this kind of resource. And I'll very briefly, just to conclude, run through my policy recommendations. There's just 5 of them, and they're pretty brief. Development of the European route of industrial heritage. Establishment of an advocacy group like Docomomo International to build public awareness. The integration of heritage structures into regional tourism and planning policy. And new legislation to replace the 2013 Act to protect significant 20th century buildings. And finally, my 5th recommendation, the proactive listing of significant buildings and the redistribution of funding for conservation across all eras, not related to age. So those are my 5 policy recommendations. That was my thesis defense. Thank you very much for listening. And thank you to my supervisory committee and to the respondents, of course, who contributed to my research. And I'm just going to leave you with a few of my favorite comments to close and over to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, David. The presentation was very, very nice. I'll open the questions time. I'll start with Carl, if he has any comment or any question about the presentation.
He's muted.
I made a classic mistake of not unmuting before I went on. But thank you for a very well organized and well delivered presentation of a project that is obviously very ambitious, and you certainly pulled it off very well in my opinion. Quite many things you could pick up on this. While you were talking, I started thinking about my trip to Scotland a few years ago. You indicated that you had worked in the UK, and I took a group of students there, and we visited, for instance, a former aluminium smelter in Scotland that had long since ceased being a smelter, but it was now an ice climbing center. And it was a fantastic example, I thought, of this kind of regeneration or finding new uses for industrial structures. And I started to think about, okay, this is something that Iceland needs to start thinking about already in terms of the aluminium industry, perhaps. But anyway, let's leave that. One thing I want to perhaps pick up from your presentation now, which I found very interesting, is this kind of tug of war that you identify between local municipal authorities and Minjastofnun on one hand, on the other hand. And this is actually perhaps one of the fields where this rural-urban divide becomes so obvious here in Iceland, and so often issues of any kind really are somehow they end up in this form of a debate. There is us versus them. It's what is called sérfræðingar að sunnan, experts from the south versus the local people, and so on. I would be interested in hearing from your experience from working in the UK, and now you're living in France, you say. Is this unique to Iceland, or is there anything we could learn from other countries' experience of dealing with this kind of rural-urban distrust, perhaps, if that is the word for it?
Thank you. I guess partly the demographic difference in Iceland makes it very different as a case study to, for instance, the UK or France, where, let's say, 15% or so of the population lives in the capital, whereas in Iceland, obviously, it's more like 65%. And that is a very different weighting in terms of funding distribution, but also public opinion. I guess I could also say the French and the British to some extent, but certainly the French are very used to traveling in their own country for their holidays. And the perception or the interpretation that I had from their interviews was that that's not the case for Icelanders, that on the whole, 101ers, let's say, tend to jump on a plane to Tenerife or wherever for their holidays rather than go to the West Fjords or to Skagastrand, let's say. And I think there is a different perception of those rural areas among city dwellers in Iceland. That would be a very subjective reaction to what you've said or you've asked. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it kind of does. Even if as a 101 person, I would strongly object to the generalization of that mindset. But let's leave that to later.
That was my interpretation of my interview. But it may well not be the case. I guess, if you like, my conclusion from my research was very much that this is a very interesting time in Iceland to really seize the opportunity of developing a domestic audience. That what has been developed in terms of infrastructure to encourage and invite 3 million foreign tourists a year into a country of 300,000 residents is not sustainable, and neither is it increasingly welcome. Although if you obviously work in the tourism industry, you may have a different opinion, but that there are these opportunities to develop these remote areas for domestic audiences, and particularly for domestic audiences that are looking to find second homes, perhaps, in these remote communities, and to start to think about their lifestyle priorities. So there are opportunities that can be seized, but I think the model is a very different one from France and the UK that I'm familiar with.
Thank you, David. Now we're going to move with Matthias.
Yep. Thanks, David, for this presentation, and especially for the very valuable policy recommendations that you presented. I think there's definitely very much value in that. You started your presentation with a hypothesis, you ended it with the hypothesis, and you said it was proven. Fine. But I think it's quite difficult to test a hypothesis solely on qualitative data. I mean, I like qualitative data. No, nothing wrong with that. But to make it more robust, what would you recommend as a necessary next step to make this data more robust?
Thanks. Well, I would say, yes, just picking up on what you said, Matthias, it's obviously important to try and understand how we could do a quantitative assessment of this kind of research. And also to see whether or not I could, or further research could expand into other areas of the country, which hasn't been the case for practical and logistical reasons, but also to try and see how most of these sites really fit together in a kind of national context. Because what I've tried to do is pick out the sites on the basis of non-judgmental values. I picked out a lot of very different sites, and I tried to extrapolate conclusions from this very varied selection. And I suspect that if it was expanded across the country, even towards one of my policy recommendations of actually creating a national listing, that could then become something that would allow real substantive quantitative research. But I'm aware, I'm conscious of the fact that I really stayed within the Northwest and the North, and that may or may not have brought up conclusions that may not apply across the country. So I guess my answer is just that. It would need to be a national study.
Okay, thanks for that. I think I have many more questions, but they will come after the public part. So I would prefer leaving it to the audience or to people on Zoom to ask you some more questions.
Yeah, so we're gonna open the time question for people here, and for people at home, you can either use the raise a hand function, or you can write your question on the chat so we can read it back. So I'm gonna start with here. Is there any questions here? Yeah, Peter is gonna ask.
Hello, David.
Hi, Peter.
Thank you. You have talked a lot on those visionary people who start something, and I think we here in Iceland know all some of them and have some people in our mind when you're talking. However, can you mention some examples of projects you researched who were not led by any visionary people, who were led by any administrative bodies? For example, the barrack in Reykjavik. I know it was not part of your research.
Yes, no, the barracks, that barrack conservation wasn't part of the research, but I'm going to tread carefully because I don't want to call certain sites not visionary. But I guess if I just come back to this specific point of this single visionary leader who starts through some dedication and is unpaid and is simply driven by their own determination, I guess we could put a site like the fertilizer factory in Guvenes into a different category. It's certainly a visionary project, but I don't think it comes within the category of being driven by a single visionary leader before it's picked up for substantial funding. I see that more as a successful endeavor and a social enterprise scheme by the municipality of Reykjavik. So I would say that is more of a municipally driven project than the others. I don't know if any others stand out to me as not driven by visionary leaders. I think they were all, from my research, basically started by one single person or a small group of people. And just to come on to this, I find this slightly odd that it's, to me, very intrinsically linked to volunteering, because these individuals who are unpaid, or groups of local residents who decide to save a particular site, are unpaid at the beginning. They work very hard. They turn up with, you know, pots of paint or whatever they start to do to try and save these sites. And yet we don't consider them to be in the classic mold of volunteering. And again, as I mentioned in the research, volunteering doesn't seem to have that take up or that even appreciation within the national consciousness. And yet these people are essentially volunteers for many years.
Any other questions?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, Ingi is gonna ask.
Thank you, David, for your.
Hi, Ingi.
I was wondering, as you mentioned before, the sites are very different, and I think the age difference in the sites and the alarm that you ran in terms of young sites being, and the pressure of being lost maybe more than the older one. Did you identify any difference between the custodians, so to speak, of the sites when it came to if they were custodians of older sites, that they had more understanding, more support than the custodians of the younger sites? Did you identify any like difference that they might have when it comes to public help and funding and so forth?
I mean, that's very interesting. I don't know if I can make that attribution to different ages and different individuals. I mean, I very carefully sidestepped the point of trying to attribute judgment to, let's say, the aesthetics of any of these sites. I mean, I'm sure that going through the slides, you may think, you know, some stand out to you as more aesthetically interesting or pleasing or significant. Aesthetics is not necessarily the only reason why we want to save buildings. Age is obviously a factor in it, but so also is the historic significance of the building, such as if it was the birthplace of an important national figure. So I think there are many criteria that go into categorizing which of our national heritage are worth saving. And that's partly why I tried to unpick the 100-year rule. But whether I could attribute different individuals to different ages of buildings, I think it's such a hybrid mix. I'm not sure I really could. I would just say that let's say the more driven artists seem to be more closely aligned with the more daunting buildings. I guess that's the only way that I can put it. And I mean, Hjaltari stands out to me as just the most daunting, extraordinary building. And those types of sites are difficult to understand unless you have this kind of visualization skill where you can actually see in your mind's eye what it would look like with proper funding. But then having said that, you know, the Guvernes site is also daunting. And as I've said, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't associate itself with a driven particular individual. So I think it's just an incredible matrix of different elements.
Thank you, David. Now we're gonna move to Laura. So Laura has a question.
All right, I think I'm unmuted. Hi.
Hi, Laura.
Lucky enough to be sitting in the middle of one of your sites right now, since I'm at Reykjavik in one of the restored outbuildings, not thankfully in the factory where it's very cold. Anyway, my question is, I was really interested in the quotes that you had right at the beginning, actually, about the sort of sense of shame or discomfort with Iceland's history and the associations that I myself have heard as well of, you know, turf houses, is we're living in mud houses. This is, you know, this was terrible when other Europeans are living in cathedrals and we're, you know, living in the ground, blah, blah. But what's intriguing to me is that the industrial sites are, of course, the leap out of that sort of poverty and misery. And I wondered if have you seen any indications that people people you've talked with, at least, are making that distinction, that the industrial heritage is actually the sort of embodied symbolism of the great leap into modernism rather than that more poverty-stricken past.
Right. Yeah, no, really interesting. And I mean, absolutely, the story of Reykjavik, the story of Hjaltari, the story of Roberhofen, those were sites that were created where villages were in a completely different scale previously. And you could even say driven by other kinds of visionaries, entrepreneurial visionaries who had the capacity somehow to create these enormous concrete structures from tiny communities of turf houses. So yes, there is a lot of evidence to show that they moved Iceland into the start of the industrial era, that they moved many Icelanders, particularly women, into paid employment for the first time, and that they were therefore very liberating and enabling structures. It just depends which community sees or perceives the after effects, if you like, of these abandoned structures as either potentially a positive or essentially a negative. And that in itself is a sociological question. Why, you know, are the wonderful people where you are in Reykjavik determined to save their building, and why in Roberhofen isn't it happening? And those are often just issues of critical mass and determination, and also telling the story. And I think that's one of the things that that Reykjavik does so well, is to tell its story, and therefore create new senses and understandings of the local narrative and the local industrial development, which has led to new wealth and did bring many communities out of the turf houses. So I would say, again, it's this matrix of different elements. But why Reykjavik and why not Roberhofen and why other sites are somewhere in between? It's a very complex question. And if only each site somehow had an easy formula, probably it would be a less interesting subject.
Thank you, David. And now we have one last question from Christian. I don't know if I have unmute you.
You should.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Christiana.
Hi, I'm Christiane from ERI, the European Route of Industrial Heritage, and we were one of the recommendations. Thank you very much for your presentation, David. Very interesting. We have been in touch to discuss options how to develop ERI in Iceland, and we obviously saw that there is a lot of potential, but no coordinated work. So my question would be, do you have any idea how the impulse could be to start the coordination? Who could be the initiator? We see that many private people are working in this. You see that there's not so much public support. Did you find any angle to start off, to kick off the process?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I would say that it's clearly a strategic decision, and to some extent a strategic decision that needs to be made on a national level to some extent. But then each site needs to buy into the need and the benefits of joining a network such as IRI. I guess from my experience of running industrial heritage projects in the UK, a lot of the time, most project managers or site managers are so nose to the grindstone, getting the daily objectives accomplished of their sites, that they often don't simply have the, let's call it, luxury of standing back and seeing a strategic purpose on a wider basis. And I think to do that, it would need some level of national government commitment in some shape or form. And I, from my conversations with interviewees on national government level, that interest does seem to be there. Obviously, there's always an issue of funding. I don't think it's particularly significant, but I think there would need to be some national coordination in order to bring people together and just give them the time and space to think about the benefits of a network like IRI. But that's a long-winded way of saying I'm sure it can be done, but I guess it just needs to be brought together. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone for attending today's defense. Now we're gonna have a 10 minutes break, so I will ask people on Zoom to leave within this 10 minutes. If not, we will need to remove them from this conversation. And yeah, thank you again, David, for a nice presentation.
Thank you.
We'll see you in 10 minutes.
Okay.